What kind of saber is this? What strength you'd need to wield it? Upon the grand stage, the god-pleasing martial warrior shook his sword, and he flicked his finger on the blade again. Another resonant ring, and from behind the golden mask, there came soft chuckling. You fought well, but you still lost, Shilian said, cheerfully and leisurely. With his weapon lost, the demon bent one knee to the ground. He was still silent, but his fists clenched harder. Shilian skillfully twirled his sword and surrounded by the cheers from all around, prepared to make his final strike and slay the demon. Just then, there was screaming from above. Shocked, Shilian lowered his sword and looked up, but he was only able to see a blurry shadow plunging rapidly from the city wall. In that split second, he didn't have time to think. He pointed his toes and pushed off the ground in a flash to leap into the air, darting upward weightlessly. He surged and flew, his sleeves fluttering open like the wings of a butterfly, then landed gracefully, light as a feather. Firmly in his hold was a person, and only when he touched solid ground did Shilian sigh a breath of relief and look down. In his arms there was a child, his head wrapped in bandages, dirty and unkempt. He was curled up in his hold and watching him dazedly. This child was no older than 7 or 8, and quite the small, gaunt creature. After falling from such a height, his little body was shaking uncontrollably in his arms like a newborn animal. However, from that mess of bandages wrapped around his head, there peeked a large black eye that reflected the silhouette of a snow-white figure. He was watching him unblinkingly, as if he could no longer see anything else. Loud gasps were heard from all around, and when Shilian raised his head, his heart sank. In his peripheral vision, he saw lying on the ground, not far away, a golden object. The golden mask that had hidden his face had fallen. Shilian had landed in the middle of the Grand Avenue of Divine Might, and the ceremonial parade was dozens of meters behind him, the procession not having made it this far yet. The sudden commotion broke the steady march of the warriors. The flower-tossing celestial maidens looked panicked. The golden carriages stopped. A number of white stallions stomped their hooves and neighed in alarm, and the strings missed notes with their rhythm disrupted. Some kept going, and some stopped. Without being able to coordinate their march again, the entire situation was spiraling out of control. The crowd on both sides of the street still hadn't the chance to react. But the king of Shinla upon the towering platform stood up immediately, looking worried and grave as he watched his son. The moment he stood, how could the rest of the nobles remain seated? They all rose to their feet in a frenzy. The state preceptor's bottom had only just warmed his seat, but now it was cold again. He was frantically deciding whether he needed to prostrate on all fours immediately to beg for forgiveness, when Chi-Rong leapt onto the railing, his sleeves rolled up, shouting in rage, "What's going on now? What's happening? Why did the procession fall into chaos? What the hell are you useless trash doing? Did you all eat nothing but plain rice? Can't even hold your horses?" The queen's face was pale, her brows lightly knitted, and she hurriedly sent for another person to drag him back. The crowds were growing agitated, and a riot was about to erupt when just then, Shilian rose to his feet once more. Usually, the honorable crown prince was hidden deep within the palace, or training at the royal holy temple, so he rarely had the chance to show his face to the people. This was such a rare occasion that many couldn't help but be intrigued, their gazes all falling on him. Yet when they gazed upon his face, their breathing hitched. That young man had long brows and charming eyes, exceptionally handsome, radiating nobility, so dazzling it forced down the eyes of those looking. With the child in one arm, he slowly raised the other with sword in hand, pointing it to the grand stage. The demon had been observing the situation from above the stage, and seeing that gesture, he paused for a moment before leaping off the parade float. The crowd wowed in amazement as the demon, his form like a streak of black cloud, stole through the air and to the stone pillar where the saber was deeply embedded. He gripped the hilt and yanked the saber out of the crack, then flipped again to land in the middle of the street before the martial warrior. Seeing that he instantaneously understood his intentions and came forward to cooperate, Shilian lauded him under his breath. Good mooching. Now, both the god-pleasing martial warrior and the demon had descended from the stage. One black, one white, one saber and one sword clashed once again, heightening the excitement, electrifying the crowd. Upon the towering platform, the faces of nobles finally relaxed, looking appeased. The demon feigned aiming for the child in the warrior's arms. With both his hands gripping the saber, he flashed the blade, then lunged at Shilian. The two fake parried, move after move, strike after strike, before they leapt back onto the stage anew. While the crowd was distracted, Mu-Ching used the opportunity to do a somersault onto the street and grab that golden mask, then dashed through the procession, urging in a low voice, "Stay in formation, compose yourselves, pretend nothing's happened and continue the march, finish marching this round and return to the palace." Everyone in the procession immediately steadied and returned to their posts, their spirits renewed. The moment Mu-Ching returned to the stage, his attacks became even more vigorous, clinking and clanking as Xi Lian received more slashes. Just then, the child in his arms cried out, probably terrified from being struck between the clashing weapons. Xi Lian's left hand held him tighter, and he whispered, "Don't be scared." Hearing his words, the small child clutched the folds of Xi Lian's robes at his chest. Even with a child in one arm and the other hand holding a sword, Xi Lian was still fighting with ease. After parrying for a while, he felt the child in his hold raise his trembling arms and grab at his shoulders in a desperate grip, as if he were hanging on for dear life. Xi Lian soothed again. "Don't worry, nothing will hurt you." Then Xi Lian ordered in a hushed voice, "Mu-Ching!" The demon facing him imperceptibly nodded, and Xi Lian struck. Thus, before the eyes of millions, the god-pleasing martial warrior pierced the heart of the demon, slaying it on the spot. Mu-Ching, with his demon mask on, clutched his wound, stumbled back a few steps, and struggled for a moment before finally, thud, he fell to the ground and stopped moving. Above, on the platform, Chi-Rong laughed out loud, applauding, "Dead! He's dead! Cousin Crown Prince has slain the demon!" While all this was happening, the magnificent heavenly procession had continued to march and soon moved onto the path back to the palace. Because of how well the act was saved and how the unexpected improvised act was so exhilarating to watch, not only did the people not complain, but their excitement grew even stronger. Countless within the crowd were shouting, "Your Highness!" or hollering, "God!" and followed behind the grand stage, thousands upon millions rushing to the palace. A few generals had to send out more troops of warriors and soldiers to block the overly excited people. In the end, they still couldn't hold them back, and the crowd broke through, pushing themselves toward the palace gates. The king of Shinla ordered from the top of the towering platform, "Guards! Warriors!" Meanwhile, the hundreds within the procession had re-entered the palace, and the giant scarlet gates closed soundly shut after the grand stage, the colorful banners of the performance now out of sight. The people rushed the gates, knocking and slapping upon it, their cheers shooting to the heavens. Inside those firmly shut palace gates, upon the grand stage, the white-clad god-pleasing martial warrior and the black-clad demon both tossed their weapons aside with clanking sounds before they collapsed heavily on the ground. Xi Lian was covered in sweat and ripped open layer after layer of his elegant costume before he heaved a long breath. "That was close. Too close. I'm exhausted." Mu-Ching also removed his heavy demon mask and let out a silent sigh, but he didn't complain about being tired. When he looked over, he saw that Xi Lian was still holding on to that young child and frowned wordlessly. Feng Xin, on the other hand, called out as he followed after the grand stage in a jog, "Your Highness, what are you doing bringing that child in too?" The young child was laying on Xi Lian's chest, his small body frozen and unmoving, afraid to even breathe loudly. Xi Lian sat up. "What was I to do? Throw him back out on the streets? It's a mess out there, and he's such a tiny creature. He'd get trampled to death." He held up the small child and stroked his head, asking casually, "How old are you, little one?" The child didn't blink, and his lips uttered no sounds. Xi Lian continued his query, coaxing, "How did you come to fall earlier?" "Your Highness, the child probably doesn't dare to speak. He's obviously scared witless," Mu-Ching said. Xi Lian stroked the head of the child again, but his unresponsiveness was making him lose interest, so he eventually stopped. "What a silly child," Xi Lian commented. "Feng Xin, go find someone to take him out through the side doors when you get a chance. And check if he's injured. His head is wrapped in bandages." "All right," Feng Xin extended his hands. "Give him here." Xi Lian held the young child up to pass him over, but when he tried, Feng Xin said, "Your Highness, why haven't you let go?" "I did let go." Shi Liang was puzzled, but when he looked down, he laughed in exasperation. It turned out it was the child who was still clutching tightly onto his clothes, refusing to let go. A few were taken aback and started laughing out loud. While training at the Royal Holy Temple, so many devotees, men and women alike, tried their hardest to get a glimpse of Shi Liang, whether out of curiosity or devotion. But as soon as they'd seen him once, they would want to see him again. If they could train next to him, even better. They couldn't believe that a child of such a young age would be the same. Guarding the grand stage were many young trainees from the Royal Holy Temple, and they all laughed. "Your Highness, this child doesn't want to leave." Shi Liang also laughed. "Is that right? That won't do. I've got my own things to take care of. Go home, little guy." At his words, the child finally, slowly loosened his grip, letting go of his clothes, and Feng Xin picked him up. Even when Feng Xin was the one holding him, the child stared fixedly at Shi Liang with his big, bright black eye, almost as if he'd been possessed. At this sight, many started grumbling under their breaths. Shi Liang, however, wasn't even looking at the child anymore, and only spoke to Feng Xin directly. "Don't dangle him like you're picking up trash. You're scaring him." Feng Xin put the child back down on the ground. "Enough joking around. The state preceptor is freaking out. Your Highness better think of how you're going to face him later." Hearing this, everyone stopped laughing. An hour later, at the Royal Holy Temple on the Divine Might Summit, inside the Palace of Divine Might, clouds of incense wafted in the air, and the sound of chanting came in waves. The chief state preceptor and 3 other deputy state preceptors sat in a line by the side wall within the great hall, their faces clouded. Mu Qing was kneeling before them. Shi Liang was also kneeling, but before him was no one but the golden statue of the heavenly emperor. Feng Xin followed his master and knelt behind him. The state preceptors picked up that exquisitely crafted golden mask, and after a moment, he heaved a heavy sigh. Your Highness. Even when kneeling, Shi Liang's back was straight, his posture perfect, and his head held high. Present. The state preceptor looked pained. Do you know that in the history of Shenle and the countless Shengyuan heavenly ceremonial processions we have held, never once has the grand stage only circled the capital thrice. Thrice! In the Shengyuan heavenly ceremonial procession, every ritual, every decoration, every place had a meaning behind it. To have the grand stage circle the capital once symbolized the kingdom's prayer for the peace and prosperity of the people for 1 year. Thus, however many rounds the grand stage made meant that many years before another such grand ceremony would need to take place. Not only did this signify good fortune, it also saved money. Having only made 3 rounds, didn't that mean the kingdom would only be protected for 3 years? The worst thing, on top of that, was the golden mask on the face of the god-pleasing martial warrior had fallen mid-ritual. Since ancient times, the people of Shenle had believed that the spiritual chi of a person gathered upon the 5 facial features. The spirit of a person was on their face, and the best must be offered to the heavens. Thus, while performing the ceremony, the martial warrior must wear a golden mask to hide his face, because his face could only be appreciated by the gods, and mortals had no right to see it. The state preceptor was both furious and disappointed. The god-pleasing martial warriors of the past circled the capital at least 5 times, at most 15 or 16. You could do 50 with your eyes closed, 100 even, but you killed yourself dead at 3. Why didn't you just kill me, your Shifu, first? Now look at you. Our dear Highness the Crown Prince is going to go down in history, dragging me along with you. No one dared speak in the great hall, and yet Shi Liang still looked at ease and responded calmly. Perhaps the state preceptor should look at it this way. If that child had fallen to his death with no one to catch him, spilling blood on the path of the procession, wouldn't that be equally ominous? Wouldn't the parade still have come to a stop? At the very least, the ceremony ended fairly respectably, which was the best-case scenario. Let's just call what happened an accident. For a moment, the state preceptor's words were stuck in his throat, but then he blew up. You child! With so many royal guards at the scene, anyone could have caught him. Even if the catch was off and he broke his arm, he wouldn't have died. You could have just marched forward a step, performed a little flashier, and everyone would have forgotten whatever had fallen and moved on. Shi Liang raised his brows, however. State preceptor, you understand as well as I do. Under those circumstances, no one else but me could have reacted as fast, and there was no second person who could have caught him without being injured. Let him fall, there'd be 1 dead. Catch him, and there'd be 2 dead. His tone was matter-of-fact and confident. The state preceptor also knew that what he had said was true and couldn't refute him. Seeing him kneel before the divine statue, looking like all was well and nothing was the matter, made the state preceptor angry, amused, and proud all at once. Before his precious, darling disciple, he just couldn't get angry, and could only pull at his own hair and use the pain of his scalp to relieve the worry in his heart. After a pause, the state preceptor spoke again. "Another thing." Shilian inclined his head. "This disciple is listening." "You did well on stage today," the state preceptor said. "But no matter how well you perform, you can't just suddenly change things up right before the start without a word of warning. Both majesties were terrified by your act today. Do you know what would have happened if we missed the fortuitous hour?" Shilian raised his brows, looking puzzled. "State preceptor, hadn't I already asked for your permission in regard to this before today?" The state preceptor was taken aback too. "You asked already? Before today? When?" Hearing this, Shilian turned his head to the side, his brows furrowed. Mooching? And that is chapter 25.